So thanks everybody for joining us for this week's Thursday 30. We've got Maureen DeLonghi, who's one of our CENMAC advisory teachers, with us this afternoon. Maureen's going to talk about assistive technology and planning ahead for SEN students to use it during their exams. If you've got any questions for Maureen, please type them into the chat and we'll answer them at the end. So thank you, and over to you, Maureen.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I've called it thinking ahead around exams access. I'm pretty sure though that for those of you that are actually working in schools on this at the moment, you've probably been thinking about it for a long time, and it's something that people are now having to think about a lot earlier than when their students get to year 11. So perhaps that's not the best title. I might need to think of another one for next year. But we're looking really at the role of assistive technology within the exams access arrangements package, because exams access is tricky enough as it is, but once you then start throwing in the assistive technology into the mix, it can become a bit of a headache if you don't feel confident about what you're doing. So we're going to look at some of the assistive technology possibilities. We're also going to look at the JCQ guidance to see how we can include that assistive technology. And you've got my email there. So Annabelle just said, if you have any questions, just pop them in the chat. But it might be an idea, just if you feel the need, to just take my email, and at any point between now and when it actually happens and the exams are underway, if you suddenly think of something you wanted to double check, please feel free to contact me and I'll be more than happy to try and help you out. So looking at the current situation, most schools will find themselves in this position at the moment. So that figure there, and actually I don't think that figure's right anymore. I think it's gone up exponentially over the last few years. We don't really know why that is, but I think lockdown may have had something to do with it. But that's a figure that's been put out nationally, that number of pupils in school sectors require additional access arrangements of some type. Now, if we break that down, that works out to about 50 students in each school. But obviously, if you've got a big school, if you're working in one of the big academies, you've probably got considerably more than that. And so that's the number of students that require a reader or a scribe. Now, if we break that down into cost, we're looking at approximately £20,000 spent just to provide those human readers and scribes, which is a phenomenal amount of money. Apart from the fact that we could save that money by looking at alternative methods, I just think it's something we should be thinking about. Is it such an advantage to be giving our scribes or readers to all of our students? And I feel really strongly about this because there's actually a lot of disadvantages to the student for having a scribe or a reader. And one of them is that they need training. Quite often, it's a really time-consuming process, and obviously you need to pay for the scribes or readers to come in and undergo that training. If you do that, that cost goes up even more. So a lot of schools try to avoid that as much as possible and just give them a very brief training before the exams start. So it doesn't really happen in a really good way. And being a scribe or reader isn't just a case of somebody to sit next to the student and be able to read for them or to be able to write for them. It's really being able to know how to draw that information and understand what the student is saying and be able to get the best out of the student. So it can really be a disadvantage to students if that isn't done well. There's also a huge amount of research that shows that the cognitive load of having a scribe or a reader is massively increased because you're adding another layer of processing to a student who already potentially has processing difficulties. So if you think about it, when you're using a scribe, you're trying to think about what you want to say. Normally, we keep a lot of that in our own head, but what you're asking them to do is to sort of tell somebody what they're trying to say whilst still trying to build on that and think about the next bit. You've got all these different layers of things that you're asking a student to do. And if that student is neurodivergent, or if that student has cognitive difficulties already, we're adding a huge amount of extra strain to their cognitive load. This issue of dual modalities, what that means is basically being able to do two things at once, being able to multitask. And we know how difficult that can be. So if you're asking a student, and often we're talking about students that have got real difficulties with their literacy and processing already, we're asking them to be able to do two things at once: to think, to talk, to explain. It's actually very, very tricky for them. And if you've got a student that's got SEN, that can become incredibly stressful. And so there is a lot of evidence that shows that using this method isn't the best thing for a lot of our students. You've also, of course, got the issue of anxiety. Having somebody sitting in close proximity to you for that amount of time, if you imagine a child with autism who finds it difficult to make personal relationships at the best of times, for some students, having a person sitting next to them just can be really, really stressful, and that will definitely have a negative impact on their performance. But the one I think is probably the most important, and is the one that is often the most neglected, is the fact that we are removing a child's independence, because we are not giving them that opportunity to do the task for themselves and to take that skill going forward. For example, when we give them a reader pen, or we give them technology that enables them to read and write at their own pace, we're giving them independence. We're allowing them to go back over the same piece of text several times at their own pace, focusing on their own particular needs, what they feel that they want to hear again or see again. And we're giving them tools to future-proof their capacity in any future educational setting, or in future exams, or in the workplace. If we take that away and we give them a scribe, or we give them a reader, and we get a third person to do all of that for them, then that person isn't going to be sitting next to them in later life. That person isn't going to be going to college with them, for example, or be sitting in exams with them at a later stage. So what you're doing effectively is de-skilling a student. And we do hear quite often, I have a number of students where the school will say, well, we've offered them the reader, but they prefer a scribe. Often that's because they haven't had the opportunity to use that reader pen enough in their earlier years. We really need to start training a student from year 7, 8, 9 to be able to really use that equipment, so that it really becomes their normal way of working, so that they develop their confidence in being able to use it. We can't just turn up to an exam and say, okay, we've got you this reader pen. A lot of children will look at that and it's just another thing that they suddenly have to learn before their exam. Of course, they're not going to accept it. So it's something we really do need to think ahead about. So that all said, what kinds of types of assistive technology are permissible in exams? Well, there's loads. Computers and generic assistive technologies such as tablets can be a really, that's the absolute basic, and they can use those for all sorts of different skills or reasons. Text to speech programs, which will include scanning and reading pens. I'll talk a bit more about those in a moment. Voice to text or dictation. Visibility tools. This can often be for students with AI, but it can also be for students who just have cognitive difficulties and need their text enlarged. Braille note takers. These are very, very specialised pieces of equipment that are used for children with visual impairment. And other sorts of lower tech assistive technology, things like coloured backgrounds and overlays that can be added separately, but also can be built into the technology, such as a tablet or a laptop, so that they automatically have the correct coloured background built in. And on top of that, we could be looking at modified equipment, adapted keyboards, for example, for students who can't use their hands properly, perhaps who can only type with one hand, etc. And those are applied for separately for individual specific students. So, students using a laptop. What kinds of students might want to use a laptop? Well, this could be for students that are using text-to-speech software. This could be where they have their questions read aloud to them, or with word processors for spell checking, for example. It's very useful for students with dyspraxia or poor motor skills, because it enables them to type their answers instead of having to handwrite. Students with speech and language difficulties can use the predictive text or communication software to be able to express their ideas more clearly. We've also mentioned visually impaired students. Students with anxiety or sensory issues, a laptop in a separate room, enabling them to reduce their stress and to manage their sensory overload. And also you will find that there are some students who have sensory issues in terms of having to write, and actually the physical action of writing on paper and holding a pencil and having to use a certain amount of strength in their hand can cause them sensory issues, especially if they're writing for any length of time. So these sorts of students would benefit greatly from using a laptop. And also students with hearing impairment, because they can have visual aids or captioned instructions on the screen for them, which will help them during their exam. So all of these would happen during their access arrangements process. But then you could have students who have their laptop, but they also have some specialised accessibility software. I've put a range of them on here. These are some of the ones that our students at CENMAC use on a very regular basis. Some of them made by Everway. We've got a text aid, read speak piece of software there, but also some of the accessibility features in Windows that are also, some of them are permissible in the exam. One of the biggest questions that we get asked is, can we use XYZ piece of software in GCSEs? And my answer is always, sometimes, yes, but not always, and it will absolutely depend on the student. There is no definitive list of equipment or software that students are allowed to use. JCQ will not give a yes or no to individual pieces of software. That's not how it works. What they will do is they will interpret whether an individual student is allowed to use a specific piece of software based on the evidence of, is it their normal way of working? So is that the way that a student would normally access their curriculum? So if typing on a laptop or using a reader pen is the normal way that they would generally access their curriculum, then the school can apply for them to use their equipment in exams. And it's as basic as that. It is down to the individual students. It's a totally personalised process, and it's down to the school to provide evidence that the student is using a piece of software that is their usual way of working. And the key is that the exams officer and the SENCO usually together will be responsible for holding the evidence that can be used to show that this is in fact the student's normal way of working. I'll be talking a little bit more about what that means and how we can show that evidence, but I just wanted to reiterate the fact that it isn't just a, can I use text aid, yes or no? It doesn't work that way. It's down to a personalised view for an individual student. We mentioned earlier reader pens. Now, reader pens have developed hugely over the last few years. The one you can see there on the top right is generally the exam reader pen that many schools have. And I've been into a lot of schools where they say, look, we've spent a fortune, we've bought a whole load of these orange reader pens. And when we offer them to the students for their exams, they say, no, I don't want one. And I just can't help thinking, well, no, of course they don't, because they've never seen that before. That's not something they're confident with. That's not something they're used to using. So just having an exam reader pen where the student isn't used to using a reader pen in their normal daily curriculum and working school life just isn't going to work for them. The one on the left there is the normal pen. This is the day-to-day reader pen that goes alongside the orange exam reader pen that students can use all the time. It's got more features, it does more things, and it can be used on a day-to-day basis. And when a student is really comfortable using that every day, then switching to an exam reader pen for their exam is not a problem for them. That won't be difficult for them at all. But just going into an exam and being expected to suddenly find a piece of technology that they're not used to using, it's hardly surprising that they're then just going to abandon it. So the two pens you can see there are called C pens. They're the most common ones that are used in schools. And actually, we are having next week, this time next week, the C Reader Pen company, I can't remember what they're called, but whoever it is that makes the C pens is providing a Thursday 30 training for us. And they will go through not just that version, which is their older version, but also their newer, higher tech version, which has all sorts of advantages and is far easier for students to use. So they will be doing a demonstration. They'll be explaining how that can be used in exams, but also across the curriculum. So if you're interested, I would definitely recommend signing up for that. The ones at the bottom are slightly more high tech. We've got the Scanning Pro Reader Pen there on the left, and we've got the, I've forgotten what that one's called, but I'm sure you'll have seen those as well. They are generally used for children with AI, but are also very useful for children with dyslexia. They're a lot more expensive, unfortunately, but they work with AI built in, so they're slightly easier to use. But I think the other three are the ones that's the Orcam. The other three are the ones you're more likely to use on a day-to-day basis. So as I was saying, use those, keep those handy, get the students really confident with using them, and then they will happily use those in an exam. Voice to text, I've just put a few examples of some of the ones that you can use, and the sorts of students that will find voice to text in an exam context really useful would be dyslexic students, for example, or students with dyspraxia, motor coordination issues, students who have processing or working memory difficulties. They can really benefit from having voice to text because it allows them to really express their ideas very quickly and then go back and make changes and adaptations and edit their work, but to get the work down as quickly as they need to. Often children with anxiety or ADHD that find the process of writing very tricky, they would benefit hugely from being able to use voice to text. And of course, students with a limited hand mobility or other physical disability can also find this an absolute game changer. And again, some of these will be usable in exams, assuming that the child is used to using this as their normal way of working. They all have an exam mode, so they can be turned into exam friendly voice to text software, but it does have to be the student's normal way of working. They can't just turn up and assume that this is something that you can give them. So all of the different types of assistive technology that we've shown you here, and I've got a few examples on that screen, they fall into two main categories. There's the ones that have to be specifically applied for, and then there's the ones that don't need to be applied for, can just be declared by the centre and no formal application is needed. It basically depends on whether they represent a modification to the exam conditions. So there are some that would assume that a change has to be made to exam conditions and therefore you have to specifically apply. You can do that through the access arrangements online or on Form 8. Or there's the ones that are just declared and you don't need to specifically ask for permission. You just declare that that's what you're going to be using. And these are ones where it's been the student's normal way of working. It doesn't give them a fair advantage. And as long as you can provide the evidence, they can just be declared and they can just use those in their exams. Just to summarise that, I've put together a little sort of chart there. So you can see which ones are ones you have to apply for and which ones you can simply declare. Just for example, a word processor, if it's a child's normal way of working and they've been using it in class the whole time, then you can just declare it. If it's one that they don't normally use, so for example, if they've just recently had an injury and therefore they're going to be using a word processor, then you would have to declare. So that's quite a neat little sort of checklist. And we are going to put this these slides into the on our website. So if you want to have another closer look at that later on, you absolutely can. So we've spoken quite a lot about normal way of working and how to prove the normal way of working and how to apply for these access arrangements. So this booklet is the sort of Bible really for exams officers in terms of applications for exams access arrangements. It slightly changes every year. So the one you can see here is for 25-26. They're very similar year on year, but there will be very slight changes each time, and they're always highlighted in yellow, so you can see where there has been a change. There's not a huge number of changes this year, not at all, but I do recommend that you download and read the newest version, just in case, because you don't want to fall foul of one of those changes. And again, the link to that will be sent out with on our website and with the recording of this training. So we keep talking about normal ways of working. What do we mean by that? Well, the JCQ interpretation of what normal way of working means is this is the way that a student is normally able to access their learning. In other words, the way that a student would normally do their work in class. There will be systems in the school to implement a whole centre approach to gather information. So lots of schools have their own methods. Some of them have special forms that they've created that are filled in by the teachers. Some will have paper documents, but all schools will always have their own way of keeping that sort of information. What we can use for that sort of information, we'll talk again in just a moment, and I'll give you some examples, but it's down to the exams officer to store this evidence in case of an inspection visit. You don't have to upload it anywhere. There isn't anything that you need to send away, but you need to store it somewhere, because generally speaking, there will be at least one inspection visit, quite often per exam board, during any exam period. And at that point, one of the things that they will quite often ask to see is your evidence of your normal ways of working. So you need to have access to that. You need to know where that is. You're not expected to upload it and send it off anywhere. So what is it? What do we mean by those normal ways of working? How can we prove that this is a child's normal way of working? Well, these are some of the ways of recording evidence. So teachers' records that have worked examples. So if a student has created something as their normal way of working and they've handed it in, an essay or a piece of work, the teachers' records will show that that was what they produced using their laptop or using their technology, and a copy of that can be kept as a record to use for their evidence. Some schools have individual pupil support plans. I'll show you an example of those. That's like a plan on a page that explains what the student uses and the sorts of things they use it for, and is something that is created over the student's life in school. So it could be something that has literally started in year 7 and is just added to and built upon as they go through the school, and that's kept as a support plan for teachers, but is also a really good piece of evidence to show for their normal way of working. Classwork, examples of pupils' work is always useful if they've produced a piece of work using their assistive technology. Photographs of them using their assistive technology to create classwork. So if they are using a reader pen, a photograph can be kept as evidence. When we provide our assessment and review reports, when CENMAC come into schools and do those, we will always write on that report what they're using their technology for. So any of those reviews and assessment reports can also be printed out and kept as part of their evidence. Checklists, I'll show you an example of one that a school has done where teachers are ticking off to say where the student has used assistive technology in their subject. So we build a whole bank of documentation that shows where the student has used it. If the SENCO is having a meeting around the child, for example, where they're explaining to class teachers how an individual student is using their technology, and providing guidance sheets for teachers, a copy of that placed into the child's folder will also be really useful evidence, as would a PowerPoint where the SENCO is teaching whole school. So this could be part of a whole school CPD where the SENCO is using a PowerPoint to show teaching staff which children are using which sorts of technology and how they can support them in their lessons. A copy of that PowerPoint could be put into that child's folder, and that would also be really useful evidence. If you have meetings like that, the staff training sign-in sheet is also another piece of really useful evidence for JCQ, because it shows that there has been ongoing training for access arrangements. And I suppose the most important one is also this child's EHCP report. If that says that they should be using pieces of assistive technology for certain aspects of their learning, that's evidence, and that goes into their folder, and that's a really useful working document. Things like mock exams as well. These are often the first opportunity that a student has had to use their access arrangements in exam conditions. So copies of their exam papers are, potentially very useful as evidence. So I said I'd show you a couple of examples. This is one that a school has created that they use all the way through from year 7, and it's on a page, and they have a different page each year, and it just gets added to, and it just shows the sorts of things that they are using and what interventions are being put into place, any out of class support that they're using, and so on. So it can be added to, and under the resources needed, assistive technology will be placed into that column to show that the student is using something on a regular basis. That will build up as they go through the different year groups and will be a really useful piece of evidence going forward. And I mentioned a checklist. This is another one that a school has created. It is literally yes or no in different subjects. So the teachers are asked to complete one of these for each of the students that has access arrangements, just stating whether or not they're using it in their lesson or not. And again, you get a nice little bunch of documents there, goes into their folder, and that is really useful evidence. So that's normal ways of working. So when do we need to start putting all of this together? This is a little timeline that I've put together just to show when you should be really thinking about these. However, I would add, it says at the start of the academic year, I'm sure most SENCOs and most exams officers have been starting some of this long before that. They will have been starting this when students are in year 8, 9 and 10, because it's an ongoing process. But if it hasn't, and you may have some students who it's only really when they get into year 11 that they start applying and start looking to apply for access arrangements, that is not an uncommon feature. So certainly by the beginning of the academic year, we should be looking at starting to prepare for that folder of evidence and looking for evidence of normal ways of working. Initial assessments, that can be internal assessments. So if they're doing exams earlier on in the year, and you can use those exams for screening who is going to be using assistive technology in the future, all of those sorts of things will be happening early on in the year. And then from October onwards, really, that those sort of 2 months there is where you're really gathering information. Having to get information out of class teachers at this time is sometimes quite tricky. So this is the time to start. Don't leave it until the last minute, because you won't be able to get that information together. There's a whole series of dates when various applications need to be made. If you look on our website again, Annabelle has really kindly put together a list of dates of when certain things need to happen. For example, if you're applying for modified papers, that happens quite early on. If you're applying for applications of assistive technology access arrangements, there's different dates when certain things need to go, and that's all outlined for you. And then from February to April, I've put implementation, and what I mean by that is sort of getting things in place. if students are going to be using laptops, if they're going to be using reader pens, we need to make sure that those laptops and reader pens have been checked, have been are definitely working, are in a particular place. We need to be planning for the roomings, because often children using them will have to be in a different room. So all those sort of little bits of background information that we need to get organised, that will all happen between February and April, running up to the exam season beginning. And then once it's about to start, that very last bit, sort of April to May, that's when we need to have our sort of final checks and final confirmation, reconfirming all the arrangements with the students, making sure parents are updated, making sure all staff have been updated, and making sure all equipment has been updated. And I've put during exams there, because just because the exams have started, that doesn't stop. We still need to be doing all of those checks all through. We don't want to find ourselves in a position where the exams have begun and the laptops have broken down and we don't have any spares. So making sure we have all of that in place before the actual exam. During the exams themselves, some little tips that I've often suggested to some of the schools where I've worked is make sure you have several, not just one, but several laptops available that aren't allocated to any students, because because this is what technology does to us, on the day of an exam, someone's laptop is not going to work or their charger will fail, and we need to have access immediately to a replacement. Same with reader pens, same with any other sorts of technology. So have plenty of spares, have plenty of extra chargers, and I would also say have your IT tech team available, or at least on the end of a phone, so that if, God forbid, everything suddenly stops working, you've got access to them straight away and you can get to them and get them into the exam room to sort things out. And once it's all over and you want to just put your feet up, you still can't, because that's the time, really, I think, when we need to be looking at reviewing what's gone well, what hasn't, what we didn't do well enough, and literally using that time for planning for the next year. Because as we said, the start of the academic year preparation phase often begins quite a lot before the beginning of the academic year. So the whole programme starts and just keeps on rolling round. And that end of year time is a really useful time to sort of start thinking about the next phase. I'm not going to go through these next slide because that's literally just what I've just said, but I've left them on here because you will have access to this PowerPoint. So if you want to go through that in a bit more detail and just see some of the things that I've just said, but I'm not going to read them out to you.
Thanks, Maureen. We're a bit past 4 now.
Okay.
Are you nearly done?
Yep. That's it.
Okay,
so that last slide there is just a summary of some of those dates, and I was just going to say that you've got the more detailed version up on the website if they want to get any more information on that. But yeah, that's a sort of a summary of when things need to happen, and that was it. That was all I was going to say, really. So yeah, it's great. I stop sharing.
Maureen, there is a question here from Nitin, who is saying, is there a permissible and VI-friendly SciCalc app iPad that is allowed to be used during exams and doesn't need to connect to the internet or requires a yearly subscription? Don't know if you know that, but we can
I don't
find out.
But we can certainly find out. That's the sort of thing that a QTVI would know immediately. So yeah, I'm sure there will be. But
yeah,
we can certainly find that out.
Mary Long might know. So
is Mary on the call? I don't think she is.
No, she's,
but we can certainly find that out.
She's not here today. Nitin, I'll let you know after the session. We'll find out for you. And
thank you.
Mr. Rodriguez, I've just put the details into the chat. I don't know if you can see them all there. I've put a link to all of these recordings are available on our website on the recordings page. I've put a link in the chat there. If you can go to your chat on your on your screen, you'll see the links there. And also we've got a special page with all of Maureen's information and more on our exam access page, which is also there. And I will actually put a link to that on the recordings page for this as well. So just feel free to email me. I'll just put my email in here as well. Just working a.
And just to add, because I should have said it earlier, I forgot as well. One of the things that people ask more than anything is about what software can people use in exams for writing, and I nearly always just say Everway, and I think you've put it in there. Everway are doing
I
one of these on the
16th. Those two sessions that are coming up. Let me just post them again because they've gone to the
they've rolled up
again. So just there now, I've put where you can sign up to any of our Thursday 30s, and those two coming up are there if you just scroll down the page. Anyway, I think we should probably leave it there as we've gone a little bit over, and I don't think there are any more questions. So
you're suggesting I talk too much?
I would never suggest that, Maureen. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and I'll hope to see you at another one soon, preferably next week.
Definitely go to next week's one.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Thank you.